We were going to throw you into a duel as soon as the shipment was delivered, Mark said coldly, rising to his feet. But now, we'll never let you donate. You're no longer a volunteer, kid. You're our golden hostage. Your father will take care of our retirement, or he'll come back to you in pieces, a little piece you won't be able to find. Today's story will give you goosebumps, so I advise you to close your eyes and enjoy the tale. And if you're a fan of popcorn and juice, now's the perfect time. Let's go. There is a very specific, deeply suffocating kind of madness that breeds in perfect safety. For 19-year-old Alex Vance, home was not a sanctuary. It was a gilded cage, a luxurious high-tech fortress situated at the end of a heavily wooded, private road in the Pacific Northwest. His father, Richard, was a high-ranking intelligence officer. Richard's career was built in the shadows, navigating a world of international threats, covert operations, and dangerous enemies. But the paranoia required for his job didn't stop at the office door. It followed him home, seeping into the very foundations of their sprawling estate. Because of the severe, classified nature of his father's work, Alex was subjected to a crushing, non-negotiable quarantine. The rules were absolute and enforced with a cold, military precision. There were no late-night trips to local cafes. There were no friends invited over for weekend gatherings. He wasn't even allowed to take a solitary walk down the private tree-lined driveway without a security detail. The estate was outfitted with biometric scanners, shatter-resistant glass, and a network of high-definition cameras that covered every possible angle of the property. To placate his son, Richard weaponized wealth. Whenever Alex complained of the isolation, whenever the crushing loneliness threatened to break him, a pristine, shrink-wrapped box would magically appear on his desk. Sometimes it was the absolute newest, most expensive smartphone on the market. Other times, it was a state-of-the-art virtual reality rig, or a custom-built gaming PC with processing power that rivaled a small server farm. It was a silent, transactional apology. Richard's logic was simple: keep the boy entertained, keep him inside, and above all else, keep him alive. But this profound isolation did not make Alex strong. It did the exact opposite. It stunted him. It fostered a deep underlying weakness in his character, a paralyzing anxiety regarding the real world outside his reinforced windows. He didn't know how to navigate social cues, how to read a room, or how to stand up for himself. He was 19 years old, but in the eyes of the world and in his own mind, he was a frightened child hiding behind a pane of bulletproof glass. However, his father's strategy had one fatal flaw. He had locked all the physical doors, but he had given Alex a wide-open window: the internet. In the digital realm, Alex wasn't a prisoner. He was whoever he wanted to be. He spent hours every single day immersed in a highly competitive, tactical online shooter. The chaotic, fast-paced environment of the game was the only place he felt a semblance of control. And it was there, amidst the digital crossfire and voice chat lobbies, that he met a player who went by the handle Mark. Mark was a phenomenally skilled player. He moved with a strategic brilliance that commanded respect, and slowly, he began to take Alex under his wing. At first, their interactions were strictly confined to the game. Mark would give him pointers, cover his blind spots, and share tactical advice. But as the weeks bled into months, the late-night gaming sessions evolved into something much deeper. They began spending hours in private voice calls, long after the game client had been closed. Mark claimed to be 19, the exact same age as Alex. He spoke with the casual, confident drawl of a young man who had the world figured out. To Alex, who was starved for any genuine human connection, Mark was a revelation. He was cool, he was understanding, and most importantly, he was willing to listen. But Mark was also a predator, and he was executing a psychological masterclass. Whenever Alex would vent about the oppressive atmosphere of his home, about the cameras, the locked doors, and his father's overbearing control, Mark wouldn't just listen, he would plant seeds. He used a slow, insidious method of psychological manipulation, chipping away at Alex's perception of reality. "You do realize you're a grown man, right, Alex?" Mark's voice would crackle through the high-end headset, laced with a perfectly calculated mixture of sympathy and disbelief. "You're 19. You're not a toddler. They have absolutely no right to lock you away like a pet." When Alex tried to defend his father, citing the dangerous enemies and the security risks, Mark would softly laugh a dismissive, knowing sound. "Your dad isn't protecting you, man. He owns you. There's a massive difference. Protection means preparing you for the world. Ownership means keeping you in a box on a shelf. Do you really want to spend the best years of your life staring at a glowing screen while the rest of the world is out there actually living? The poison was slow acting, but incredibly effective. I'm the only one who actually understands. You, Alex, Mark whispered late one night, the digital static masking the true intention behind his words. To them, you're just a liability. You're a burden they have to keep an eye on. They don't see you as a person. I do. These words resonated in the hollow chambers of Alex's isolated heart. The frustration he felt toward his father began to curdle into a deep, toxic resentment. He stopped seeing the expensive gifts as apologies and started seeing them as heavy iron chains. Mark was no longer just a friend from an online game. In Alex's warped, gaslit perspective, Mark was a savior. He was the only tether to the real world. The boiling point arrived on a Tuesday evening. The rain was lashing against the reinforced glass of Alex's bedroom window, a steady, drumming sound that matched the escalating tension in the house. Alex was on a voice call with Mark, laughing hysterically at a joke, leaning back in his expensive leather gaming chair. He felt relaxed, rebellious. He didn't hear the heavy, authoritative footsteps marching down the hallway. The bedroom door flew open without a knock. Richard stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh hallway light. His face was a mask of exhausted fury. He had just finished a brutal 14-hour shift managing a crisis Alex couldn't even fathom, only to find his son shouting and laughing into the early hours of the morning, neglecting his online college courses for the third day in a row. "Take that headset off," Richard commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Alex froze, the laughter dying in his throat, but the months of Mark's whispering echoed in his mind. "He owns you. You're not a toddler." Instead of complying, Alex stood up. His hands were shaking, but his jaw was set. "No," he said, his voice trembling but defiant. "I'm talking to my friend." In 3 long strides, Richard crossed the room. He didn't hit him, but he snatched the headset off Alex's ears with such force that the wire snapped, the expensive plastic cracking against the desk. "You have no friends," Richard barked, the stress of his hidden world bleeding into his tone. "You have strangers on a screen who do not understand the danger you are in. I keep you safe. I keep you breathing." For the first time in his entire life, the pent-up rage inside Alex erupted. The fear vanished, replaced by a blinding adolescent fury. "You're not protecting me," Alex screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the mansion. "You're suffocating me. You're treating me like a prisoner. I'd rather be dead out there than live another day in this pathetic cage." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at his son, his eyes cold, calculating, and ultimately disappointed. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply reached over to Alex's desk, picked up the keys to the Audi that Alex was only allowed to drive around the estate's private perimeter, and slipped them into his pocket. "You are grounded," Richard said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Your network access will be cut at midnight. Do not leave this room." He turned and walked out, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a terrifying finality. Alex stood in the center of his room, his chest heaving, tears of pure frustration stinging his eyes. He grabbed his phone, the one device running on a separate cellular data plan, and immediately opened an encrypted messaging app. His fingers flew across the glass screen. "He took my keys. He's cutting the internet. I can't do this anymore." The response from Mark was almost instantaneous. "I told you, man. He's a warden, not a father. It's time to make a choice. Are you going to be his prisoner forever, or are you going to be a man? Put them in a position where they have to respect your independence." "How?" Alex typed, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm in your state. I've been road tripping. I can be at the bottom of your private road in 2 hours. Sneak out. We'll go to the city, get some food, hang out for the night. Show him you can survive without his permission. When you come back tomorrow, the dynamic will be changed forever." It was a terrifying proposition. Leaving the estate was the ultimate taboo, but the adrenaline of the argument, combined with the desperate desire to prove Mark right, clouded his judgment. "Okay," Alex replied. "I'll be at the main gate at 2 a.m. The next 2 hours were the longest of Alex's life. He packed a small backpack with his wallet, a heavy hoodie, and a portable charger. He waited until the house settled into a deep, heavy silence. He knew the security system better than anyone. He knew the exact blind spots of the motion sensors in the downstairs hallway, and he knew how to manually unlatch the side patio door without triggering the magnetic alarm. The night air was freezing, biting through his clothes as he slipped out into the darkness. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, oppressive fog hanging over the tall pine trees. He walked down the long, winding driveway, jumping at every snapped twig, his breath pluming in the cold air. When he finally reached the towering wrought-iron gates at the edge of the property, he squeezed through a gap in the surrounding hedgerow that he had discovered years ago. Idling on the shoulder of the dark, isolated road was a massive black SUV. Its headlights were off, its engine emitting a low, powerful rumble. Alex approached the passenger side, his heart fluttering with a mix of terror and exhilarating freedom. He reached out and pulled the heavy door handle. The moment the interior light flicked on, the fantasy shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Sitting in the driver's seat was not a 19-year-old kid. The man behind the wheel was in his late 40s, heavily built, with a thick neck, a graying, unkempt beard, and eyes that held absolutely no warmth. He wore a faded tactical jacket, and his hands, resting on the steering wheel, were scarred and calloused. "Mark," Alex whispered, his voice catching in his throat, a cold wave of dread washing over him. The man smiled, revealing stained teeth. "Hey there, kid. Get in." Alex took a step back, every single survival instinct he had previously ignored suddenly screaming at him. He looked to the passenger side. Sitting in the seat right next to where Alex was supposed to enter was another man. This man, Jack, was gaunt, hollowed out, with deeply sunken, bloodshot eyes that stared at Alex with a predatory intensity. He looked sick, twitchy, and profoundly dangerous. I think I changed my mind," Alex stammered, taking another step backward toward the safety of the estate's hedgerow. "Don't be rude, Alex." "We drove a long way," Mark said, his voice losing the friendly, youthful cadence he had faked for months. It was now gravelly, authoritative, and terrifying. Before Alex could turn and run, Jack lunged across the center console, grabbing Alex by the front of his hoodie with a grip like a steel vise. With a violent, terrifying surge of strength, he yanked Alex into the spacious back seat of the SUV. Alex crashed onto the leather upholstery. He scrambled backward, throwing his weight against the heavy rear door, grabbing the handle and pulling with all his might. Clunk! The sound of the electronic child locks engaging echoed through the cabin like a vault slamming shut. The interior door handle went completely slack in Alex's hand. He was trapped. "Hey, let me out! Let me out!" Alex screamed, slamming his fists against the tinted, reinforced glass of the SUV. Mark casually shifted the vehicle into drive and pulled away from the curb, the tires throwing wet gravel into the darkness. "Calm down, kid. You wanted a ride. We're giving you a ride." Jack turned around in the passenger seat. In his hand, he held a thick, dark, hand-rolled cigar. But as he clicked a lighter and ignited the tip, the smell that filled the cabin wasn't tobacco. It was intensely sweet, synthetic, and smelled faintly of burnt plastic and harsh chemicals. Jack took a deep drag and then, leaning over the center console, blew a massive thick cloud of the dense gray smoke directly into the back seat. "Breathe deep, little bird," Jack rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across concrete. Alex coughed, desperately trying to wave the smoke away, pressing his face against the cold glass. But the ventilation system in the back had been shut off. The smoke was thick, cloying, and unavoidable. He had to take a breath. The moment the chemical vapor hit his lungs, the reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. A wave of intense, violent nausea rolled through his stomach. The edges of his vision began to blur, dissolving into a fuzzy, static gray. His heart, which had been hammering a second ago, suddenly slowed to a heavy, lethargic thud. He tried to scream again, to demand they stop the car, but his tongue felt like a piece of lead in his mouth. A horrific tingling numbness started at his fingertips and raced up his arms, spreading down his spine and into his legs. It wasn't just sleep, it was paralysis. Through the fading tunnel of his vision, he saw Mark looking at him. In the rearview mirror, his eyes completely dead, completely devoid of empathy. "Just relax, Alex," Mark's voice echoed, sounding like it was coming from underwater. "You're entering the real world now." Alex slumped against the door, his muscles turning to liquid. The last thing he registered before the suffocating darkness pulled him under was the rhythmic hum of the SUV's tires devouring the highway, carrying him farther and farther away from the cage that had been designed to keep him alive. When consciousness returned to Alex, it didn't arrive gently. It crashed into him with a wave of blinding pain and intense dehydration. His mouth tasted like old copper and battery acid. His head throbbed with a sickening rhythmic pulse. He groaned, struggling to open his eyes. The harsh, dim light of dusk filtered into his vision. The air was brutally dry and cold, carrying the scent of dust, rust, and sagebrush. He wasn't in the Pacific Northwest anymore. The wet pine trees were gone, replaced by a barren, rocky wasteland. He was lying on his side in the dirt. He slowly pushed himself up to his hands and knees, his muscles screaming in protest, still fighting the lingering, heavy lethargy of whatever chemical they had forced him to inhale. He patted his pockets frantically. His phone was still there. He pulled it out. No service. He looked around. They were parked in what looked like an abandoned, dilapidated train yard or a forgotten industrial depot deep in the high desert. Rusted husks of old rail cars sat on weed-choked tracks. The black SUV was parked a few yards away, its tailgate wide open. "Look who's back from the dead," a voice called out. Alex flinched. Mark and Jack were standing by the back of the SUV. They had removed their jackets, revealing heavy holsters strapped to their chests. Real firearms, black, metallic, and terrifying. "Get up," Mark barked, tossing a pair of heavy work gloves onto the dirt in front of Alex. "You wanted to know what real work looks like. Time to earn your keep. Get over here and help Jack unload." Alex's whole body was trembling. He was terrified, disoriented, and utterly defenseless. He stumbled to his feet, picking up the gloves. He walked toward the back of the SUV. Inside the cavernous trunk were 6 massive, olive-drab wooden crates. They looked incredibly heavy, bound with steel straps. "Grab that end," Jack ordered, pointing a trembling finger at the handles of the nearest crate. Alex reached out, gripping the rough wood. 1, 2, 3, pull. Jack grunted. The weight was staggering. Alex's arms, unaccustomed to any real physical labor, strained agonizingly as they slid the crate out of the trunk. They carried it toward a dilapidated warehouse building a few yards away. As they approached the rusted doors, Alex's foot caught on a heavy, submerged piece of rebar sticking out of the cracked concrete. His ankle twisted violently. With a sharp cry of pain, his grip failed. The heavy crate slipped from his hands, crashing to the concrete with a deafening, splintering crack. "You stupid kid!" Jack roared, reaching for the sidearm at his hip. But Alex wasn't looking at Jack. He was staring in absolute horror at what had spilled out of the shattered wooden panels. The impact had broken the steel straps. Spilling onto the dusty concrete was a terrifying arsenal. Dozens of sleek black assault rifles, still slick with factory packing oil. Heavy, stacked boxes of high-caliber ammunition. And beneath them, cylindrical, military-grade explosive ordnance. The air rushed out of Alex's lungs. These weren't petty criminals. This wasn't a kidnapping for a quick ransom. This was a highly organized, heavily armed smuggling operation. Before Mark could step forward to punish him, the rusted metal doors of the warehouse shrieked open. A man stepped out into the fading light. He was short, stocky, and completely silent. His face was entirely obscured by a black tactical balaclava. He surveyed the broken crate, the spilled weapons, and then locked his gaze on Alex. The sheer radiating menace coming off the masked man made the blood freeze in Alex's veins. He realized, with absolute clarity, that human life meant absolutely nothing to the people standing in this yard. "Get in the van," Mark ordered, pointing to the passenger compartment behind the front seats. Alex climbed in, huddling into the corner of the dark, metal-walled space. Jack got in the back with him, clutching a short-barreled submachine gun across his chest, his sunken eyes never leaving Alex. Mark climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. They left the abandoned rail yard, merging onto a dark, desolate 2-lane highway that stretched endlessly through the desert. The silence in the back of the van was agonizing. Alex hugged his knees, the adrenaline keeping him painfully awake. An hour into the drive, the atmosphere in the vehicle suddenly shifted. Mark cursed violently from the front seat, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. "What is it?" Jack hissed, sitting up straight, his finger inching toward the trigger of his weapon. "Surprise inspection," Mark growled. Alex peered through the metal grating that separated the front seats from the back. Far down the dark highway, a mile ahead, a cluster of red and blue lights flashed intensely against the pitch-black desert night. It was a heavily fortified police checkpoint. High-powered spotlights were sweeping across the lanes. A surge of wild, desperate hope ignited in Alex's chest. The police, the authorities. This was his chance. He just needed to scream, to make a noise, to get their attention when they stopped. "Mark, turn around." Jack panicked, looking at the heavy crates surrounding them. "We can't go through that. We're loaded to the roof. I can't turn a utility van around on a flat highway. They'll see the taillights and chase us down," Mark yelled back, his eyes darting frantically. "Hold on to something, please," Alex suddenly cried out, unable to contain his terror. "Please, just stop. Just surrender. They'll let you live, I swear. Please, just pull over." Mark ignored him, his foot pressing down hard on the accelerator. The engine roared, struggling to propel the heavy vehicle forward. They approached the checkpoint at terrifying speed. The police officers, standing by their cruisers in high-visibility vests, immediately realized the van wasn't slowing down. They began shouting, raising their flashlights, and unholstering their weapons. "Jack, clear the way!" Mark screamed as he veered the van toward the narrow gap between the concrete barriers. Jack didn't hesitate. He kicked open the sliding side door of the moving van just an inch. He shoved the barrel of the submachine gun through the crack and squeezed the trigger. The noise inside the metal van was apocalyptic. The deafening staccato roar of automatic gunfire in an enclosed space shattered Alex's equilibrium. Hot brass casings rained down on him, burning his skin as they bounced off the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut, covering his ears and screaming at the top of his lungs. But he couldn't drown out the sound of the gunshots, the shattering of the police cruiser windshields outside, and the frantic, echoing return fire. A bullet from outside tore through the thin metal siding of the van, passing inches from Alex's head with a terrifying sonic crack, burying itself into one of the wooden crates. Mark swerved violently, the tires screeching and smoking as they smashed through a plastic barrier, blowing past the checkpoint and rocketing into the darkness on the other side. Jack pulled his gun back in and slammed the door shut, breathing heavily, a sick, twisted smile spreading across his pale face. Alex lay curled on the metal floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The smell of sulfur and burnt gunpowder was suffocating. In that horrifying moment of violence, Alex realized a devastating truth. He was in a van filled with illegal military-grade weapons, fleeing a scene where police officers had just been fired upon. He was no longer just a kidnapped kid. The law wouldn't see a victim. They would see an accomplice. They would see a terrorist. Mark hadn't just stolen his freedom. He had stolen his entire life, burning down every bridge back to normalcy. They drove for hours, turning off the main highway and navigating a labyrinth of unmarked dirt roads, venturing deep into the unforgiving, desolate heart of the desert. The van finally crawled to a stop outside a small, remote hunter's cabin, a structure that looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. "Get him out," Mark ordered, his voice tight with the lingering adrenaline of the shootout. Jack hauled Alex out of the back of the van by his collar, throwing him onto the hard-packed earth. Alex's psychological dam completely broke. The fear, the isolation, the deafening memory of the gunfire, it all came pouring out. He scrambled backward in the dirt, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face. "Please," Alex begged, his voice cracking, completely devoid of any remaining pride. "I'll do whatever you want. Just let me go. Leave me out here. I'll walk. You don't understand who you're dealing with. My father is Richard Vance. He's a senior director in the intelligence community. He commands Black Ops teams. If you hurt me, he will hunt you down. He will find you, and he will not let you live. Please let me go." The moment the words left his mouth, a chilling, absolute silence fell over the remote clearing. The desert wind seemed to stop. Mark, who had been walking toward the cabin door, froze. He slowly turned around. The annoyance and stress on his face vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, terrifying clarity. He looked at Jack, who was staring back with wide, greedy eyes. Mark walked slowly back toward where Alex was cowering on the ground. He squatted down, his heavily built frame casting a long, dark shadow over the teenager. The malicious, wicked smile that crept across Mark's face was the most terrifying thing Alex had ever seen. "Richard Vance," Mark repeated softly, tasting the name, high-ranking intelligence, access to classified networks, access to federal seized funds. A man who would do absolutely anything to get his only beloved son back. Alex's stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. He realized, with a sickening jolt of absolute horror, exactly what he had just done. In his desperate attempt to use his father's power as a shield, he had just painted a massive, glowing bullseye on his own back. "Thank you, Alex," Mark whispered, his voice dripping with venomous delight. "Thank you for sharing that vital piece of information. You just changed the entire objective." Mark reached into Alex's pocket and violently yanked out his smartphone. "We were going to dump you in a ditch once the delivery was made," Mark said casually, standing up. "But now we are never going to let you go. You aren't a liability anymore, kid. You're our golden hostage. Your father is going to finance our retirement, or he's going to receive his boy back in very small, very untraceable pieces." Mark walked over to a rusted metal burn barrel sitting outside the cabin. He pulled a lighter from his pocket, igniting a pile of oily rags and dry desert wood inside the barrel. The flames leaped up, casting a hellish flickering orange glow against the dilapidated cabin. Mark held Alex's phone over the flames. "Say goodbye to the internet, kid," Mark sneered, and dropped the device into the fire. Alex watched from the dirt as the flames licked the glass screen. He watched the plastic casing begin to warp and bubble. He watched the internal battery spark and hiss before melting down entirely. As the phone disintegrated into a puddle of toxic slag, Alex felt his entire previous life burning away with it. The high-tech room, the expensive computers, the oppressive but perfectly safe walls of his father's estate, they were gone forever. He was out in the real world now, just like he had always wanted. But the real world was a cold, vicious place, and Alex was nothing more than a helpless pawn in a brutal, bloody game he had never intended to play. The isolation of his gilded cage had been suffocating, but as Jack dragged him kicking and screaming into the pitch-black darkness of the remote cabin, Alex realized that true hell wasn't being locked inside a fortress. True hell was being locked outside of it, utterly alone, with the monsters,